story time once again with your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian. Today on the menu is A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege, Chapter 12. I'm not sure this is such a good idea. Jerome sat in the front passenger seat of Elle's silver Eldorado while Cheryl drove. Elle had loaned them his car so Cheryl could drive him home. She'd helped him clean him up in the restroom at Showtime Video. And while he still looked like a guy that had been in the fight, he no longer looked as if he were one step away from needing the services of an undertaker. "Well, I do," Cheryl said. "It's going to be hard enough for you to explain what happened to your folks on your own." She gave him a quick glance. "Especially after what happened in detention between you and Pat Cottrell just earlier this afternoon. I insist on being there when you talk to your dad and stepmom, for moral support if anything else." Jerome wanted to argue the point further, but he knew it was no use. Once Cheryl had made up her mind, there was no changing it, especially if she believed she was doing the right thing. While part of him worried that her presence would only complicate the situation when he got home, he was also glad to have her support and was touched by her love and loyalty. Not for the first time, he wondered what he'd ever done to deserve someone as wonderful as Cheryl Garinger as his girlfriend. He figured it was most likely due to some cosmic screw-up on the part of the universe. But whatever the reason, he was grateful that she was in his life. They drove through one of Springwood's nicer residential neighborhoods, though not quite as nice as where Jerome lived. Full night had fallen and Cheryl had the Eldorado's headlights on. She slowed as they approached an intersection. And in the wash of headlights illumination, Jerome saw the street sign on the corner. They were at the intersection of Poplar and Elm Street. Jerome wasn't sure why, but he felt a cold prickling on the back of his neck upon seeing the sign. Cheryl activated the left turn signal, but before she could perform the maneuver, Jerome said, "Why don't you just keep going straight?" He tried to keep the nervousness he felt out of his voice, but he knew he'd failed by the half-puzzled, half-suspicious look that Cheryl gave him. "But it's faster to go down Elm," she said, "unless you want to postpone talking to your folks as long as possible. Then I'll be glad to take the slow way." Jerome wasn't looking forward to talking with his dad and Lynn, but that was not the reason for his reluctance to take Elm Street. But since he couldn't express why he was reluctant, he said, "Never mind, Elm's okay." Cheryl looked at him for a moment longer, as if giving him a chance to explain. But he said nothing more, so she faced forward, pressed down on the gas, pulled into the intersection, and turned left. As soon as they began driving down Elm Street, a cold, shivery feeling settled into the pit of Jerome's stomach and made itself comfortable there. Halfway down the street they came to it, the house. 2 stories, gray, unpainted wood, roof full of holes and ready to collapse, planks nailed over the windows, front steps chipped and cracked. The yard was covered with dead brown weeds, and the few trees that still survived were stunted, leafless mockeries of plant life. Jerome didn't know anything about the house, beyond the fact that it was a bad place and everyone, especially kids, were supposed to stay away from it at all costs. Not only that, but people didn't even like to look at it as they went past it. It was almost as if citizens of Springwood were determined to make believe that the house didn't exist. Like if they could just make believe hard enough, maybe it really would go away. But it never did. It was always there, sitting like some sort of stubborn growth that defied all attempts to have it removed. Then they were past the house, and Jerome's unease began to subside, though it didn't disappear entirely. They continued on in silence, and several minutes later Cheryl pulled the Eldorado to a stop in front of Jerome's house. The lights were on, of course. He couldn't be lucky enough to find Dad and Lynn had given up on waiting for him and gone out for the evening. And to make matters worse, there was a green Volkswagen Beetle parked in the driveway, with bumper stickers that proclaimed, "Miracles happen," and "Think globally, act locally." Jerome groaned. "Becca's here, too. She said she was going to come over, but I forgot all about it. I hope she hasn't been here too long. The more time she and Lynn spend around each other, the more they end up fighting." He was tempted to tell Cheryl to start the car up again and drive off, but he knew he couldn't avoid his family forever. Besides, after everything that had happened today, he was actually kind of looking forward to seeing them, even Lynn. He hated to admit it to himself, but he needed to be around them, to be around normalcy again. So what if he didn't always get along with his family? That didn't seem to matter much anymore, not since Freddy had gotten to his head. So he and Cheryl got out of the car, and she took his hand as they crossed the walkway to the front door. He recalled trying to sneak in last night, It seemed as if that had happened weeks ago instead of less than 24 hours. At least this time I'm going in the front, he thought. He pulled his house keys out of his pocket, unlocked the front door, and stepped aside so Cheryl could enter first. She gave him a smile and squeezed his hand. Such a gentleman. Then she entered and Jerome followed. He half expected Dad and Lynn to be standing in the foyer waiting for him, arms crossed, stern expressions on their faces, but no one was there. He closed the door and locked it, then paused and listened. Usually Brian and Mary were screaming like banshees as they fought over who got that toy or whose turn it was to play the Xbox, but he heard nothing. Cheryl cocked her head as she looked at him. "What's wrong?" Jerome shook his head, not sure yet how to reply. He started slowly down the foyer, and Cheryl followed, frowning. He felt as if he should tell her to remain by the front door as he checked the house out, but he didn't want to look like a paranoid idiot. What was he afraid of anyway? That Freddy Krueger, whatever the hell he was, had somehow escaped the realm of dreams and entered the real world? That the scar-faced lunatic had used that bladed glove of his to cut Jerome's entire family to shreds? That he would find bits and pieces of them scattered around the house, a finger here, an ear there, as if Freddy had set up some kind of obscene scavenger hunt? As much as it chaps my ass to admit it, I'm limited when it comes to the trouble I can cause in the physical world. That is what Freddy had said. But what if Freddy had been lying? What if everything he'd said had been a lie, all part of whatever sick mind game the bastard was playing? What if Freddy was in the house right now, standing over the eviscerated bodies of Jerome's family, his fingerknives dripping with thick strands of blood and body parts? Fear surged in Jerome's chest, and he broke into a run, leaving Cheryl behind. His shoes pounded on the hallway carpet as he moved deeper into the house. "Dad!" he called. "Lynn!" "Jerome, what's wrong?" Cheryl called after him, and he heard the sound of her running to catch up to him. He didn't slow down. He raced to the dining room, and when he got there, he stopped so fast that he nearly lost his balance and fell. His family sat at the dining table. Dad, Lynn, Brian, Mary, and Becca. As usual, Lynn sat as far away from Becca as she could. Brian sat next to Becca, while Mary sat on her lap. Both of his step-siblings had chocolate smeared across the lower half of their faces. "Hi, Jerome," Mary said with a chocolatey grin. "Aunt Becca brought cupcakes." On the table was an open plastic container that did indeed hold cupcakes, though not so many as it had when first opened. Each of the adults had one sitting on a small plate in front of them, along with cups of coffee and, in Becca's case, herbal tea. Though as yet they'd only nibbled at their desserts. From the chocolate on their faces and the crumbs on their plates, it was obvious that Mary and Brian had absolutely devastated their first cupcakes and were now hard at work on seconds. His step-siblings were far too engrossed in their treats to take note of Jerome's condition. But the three adults weren't so distracted. "My God, Jerome, what happened to you?" Lynn said, starting to rise from her chair. "Did you have an accident?" Before he could say anything, Cheryl caught up to him and joined him in the entryway to the dining room. She put a hand on his shoulder as if she were afraid he might take off again if she didn't hold him in place. "Hi, everyone," she said. Lynn stopped in mid-rise as if unsure whether she should stand up all the way or sit back down. "Hello, dear." She looked to Don, then Becca, then back to Don again. Jerome's father shrugged, and Lynn decided to take her seat once again. The only one who didn't look surprised by Jerome's appearance was Becca. She did, however, look concerned, and, for some reason, sad. "Why don't you two sit down?" Jerome's father said. "We'll get you something to drink, and then we can talk about whatever's going on." When he was finished speaking, he gave Becca a sideways glance. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and Don relaxed. Lynn noticed Becca's nod, though, and frowned, but she didn't comment on it. Jerome was glad for Becca's presence. Because she'd brought cupcakes, the kids were still here, and that meant Dad and Lynn would be reluctant to start yelling at him right away. Plus, since Becca was his mother's twin, Don tended to defer to her when it came to Jerome, almost as if she really were his mother. It was one of the numerous reasons that Lynn wasn't especially fond of Jerome's aunt, along with the way Brian and Mary called her aunt when she was no relation to them by either blood or marriage. As if seizing an opportunity to get away from Becca, Lynn said, "I'll go get the drinks," and started to stand up again. "Coffee okay, Jerome?" He nodded, then winced as the motion set his head to hurting again. "Regular, please." He had no intention of sleeping tonight. Maybe ever again if he could help it. "Tea for me, if you don't mind," Cheryl said. Lynn's answering smile seemed genuine enough. Jerome had the sense that she really liked Cheryl, which always came as a relief since she didn't like Becca. Lynn finished getting up and left the dining room. There were only 2 chairs unoccupied, one of them by where Lynn had been sitting. Without waiting for Jerome to express a preference, Cheryl walked over to the seat next to Lynn's and sat down. It seemed his girlfriend intended to serve as a buffer between Jerome and his stepmother if need be. He smiled at her thoughtfulness, though it made his swollen lip crack open and start to bleed again. He rubbed at the cut with his fingers and wondered yet again how he'd ever gotten so lucky to have someone as great as her to care for him. Jerome walked over and took the last empty seat. Everyone was silent for several moments after that. At least, no one spoke. The kids were devouring their second cupcakes with such gusto that the dining room echoed with their chewing, smacking, slurping, and glurping sounds. Lynn soon returned with plates and saucers, then went back to the kitchen and brought out their coffee and tea. She set the drinks down on the saucers in front of Jerome and Cheryl and said, "Help yourselves to one of Becca's cupcakes," then sat down next to Dawn. She looked at Jerome expectantly, her expression calm enough, but her eyes quivered with worry and nervousness, and her right foot tapped rapidly against a chair leg, a sure sign that she was upset. Jerome took a deep breath and then started to talk. He gave them an edited version of events. No possessed frogs, no nightmares, and absolutely no Freddy Krueger. When he was finished, Lynn's face had become a shade or two paler, and his dad looked as if he wanted to both hug and throttle his son at the same time. "We should take you to the doctor," Lynn said. "If you can't remember what happened in the alley when you were attacked, it might be because you sustained a serious head injury." "Elle told me the same thing," Jerome said, "but I honestly feel fine, y'all." Maybe not so honestly, but he didn't feel like he was going to kill over dead any minute either. It was dark in the alley and everything happened so fast. More than anything else, I think that's the main reason my memories of the attack are so fuzzy. "You lie like you were born to it." The interior voice sounded amused, and this time it was accompanied by a mental image of the fetus thing Freddy had pulled from the lake in Jerome's last dream. Was that who the voice belonged to? To that creature? "That makes sense," Don said. "We'll just keep an eye on you and see how you do. If it looks like we need to take you to a hospital, we will. Sound good to you, Lynn? Becca?" Lynn didn't look too happy, but she didn't disagree with her husband. Becca had remained silent the entire time Jerome had been telling his story. He'd had the feeling that she was perfectly aware that he was lying, or at least omitting certain details. But she'd done nothing other than sit quietly while he talked. But now that Dawn had put a direct question to her, she responded. "Jerome's injuries, his physical ones anyways, aren't so serious that he needs a doctor. As for his spiritual wounds, though," she trailed off. Jerome looked at Becca hard, willing her to receive the thought message he was broadcasting. "Please, no weird stuff. Not now, not here. Just let me do my own thing and I'll figure it all out before too long, I swear." But if Becca had received the mental message, she gave Jerome no sign of it. "Please, Becca," Lynn said. "You know how I feel about anything of an occult nature being discussed in my house." She glanced at Mary and Brian, their faces still dirty, bellies bulging from all the cupcakes and milk they'd ingested. "I don't want to expose the children to such things." From the way she stressed that last word, it was clear that by things she really meant horse shit. Not that Mary and Brian were paying any attention. They both looked on the verge of falling asleep. Dawn rose. "Tell you what, I'll go get the kids washed up and ready for bed, and once they're tucked in, I'll be back." Lynn looked as if she wanted to protest being left with Becca without Dawn there to referee, but she nodded. Dawn stood, went over to Becca, and picked up a nearly unconscious Mary. Brian was equally tired, but he was older and bigger, and thus had to walk on his own. The kids mumbled goodnight to Becca, kissed her on the cheek, then allowed their father to escort them to the bathroom for face washing and toothbrushing. Brian held on to Dawn's hand as they left the living room. "Is Jerome going to be okay?" he asked sleepily. "Of course he is," Dawn said, though Jerome could hear the doubt in his dad's voice. Once Brian and Mary were out of the dining room, Becca resumed speaking. "What I'm going to tell you might sound ridiculous at first, Jerome, Cheryl, but you need to believe me. Your lives may very well depend on it." Lynn gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Don't do this, Becca." There was anger in her voice, but also a tone of pleading. "You know how important it is that we don't say anything about him." Jerome felt as if Lynn's words had struck him a physical blow. She wasn't telling Becca that she was nuts. She sounded like a co-conspirator urging a comrade to maintain secrecy. "That's exactly right," the voice in his head whispered. "They're in it together. All of them. Lynn, Becca, your dad." "In on what?" Jerome thought. "In on the lie," came the answer. "We have to tell them, Lynn," Becca said. "It's the only way." Lynn looked at Jerome's aunt for a long moment, and then she let go of the table edge and placed her hands in her lap. She released a sigh, then nodded. "All right, just go ahead." Jerome wanted to interrupt, to ask Lynn and Becca why they were suddenly talking, if not like friends, then at least like allies. But he feared that if he said anything, Lynn might rescind her cooperation, and he and Cheryl might never get a chance to hear what Becca had to say. Besides, he already knew, didn't he? They were in on it, both of them. Many years ago, a child killer stalked the streets of Springwood. He murdered dozens of children before he was caught. But instead of going to prison, he got off on a technicality. Outraged, the town's parents banded together to take justice into their own hands. They confronted the killer, and they burned him alive. "How awful," Cheryl said. Jerome took her hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze, but his gaze was focused on Lynn. She looked down at the table as if she didn't want to meet Becca's eyes, or like she was afraid to. "At least she has the decency to look ashamed about lying to you all these years," whispered the voice in Jerome's head. "Lying and keeping secrets." Jerome felt the first stirrings of anger inside him, and he fought to ignore them, to stamp out their sparks and prevent them from becoming a raging fire. "But the killer did not die," Becca continued. "At least, not as most people understand the concept of death. His body was destroyed, but his foul spirit somehow survived and found a new home in the realm of dreams. There, he became far more powerful than he'd ever been as a mortal killer, and he began to plot his revenge against the parents who had taken his life." Though the dining room was warm, Jerome shivered as if a cold breeze suddenly wafted through it. "Freddy Krueger," he whispered. Lynn jumped at the sound of the killer's name, as if saying it might somehow be enough to summon him, but Becca just nodded. "That's right. Freddy used his new dark powers to reach out to Springwood's surviving children, many of them now grown into teenagers, through their dreams, and the killing began again. You see, Becca knew about Freddy too, and she never said a word about him to you your entire life." The anger began to build again, and this time Jerome didn't bother to try to control it. Lynn looked up at Becca, her expression defiant, though her voice trembled. They stopped him, though, right?" "For a time," Becca acknowledged. "But while Krueger was beaten, he was not destroyed. He retreated to the dream realm to lick his wounds and restore his strength. The cycle would be repeated a number of times. Months, sometimes years would pass, and then the killing would start anew." Becca paused then, but Jerome couldn't speak. He wanted to deny what Becca was saying, wanted to tell her she was full of shit, then get up and walk away and pretend that he had never heard of Freddy Krueger. But he couldn't, not after everything that had happened to him in the last 24 hours. He understood then why Miss LeClaire had asked him if he'd been having any strange dreams lately. She knew all about Freddy Krueger too. It seemed like everyone knew, except him. "They're liars," the voice said. "Every one of them." "That old abandoned house on Elm, the real spooky one," Jerome said. "That's his home, isn't it?" "Yes," Becca said. "And it's still the center of his power in the real world. Even people who aren't physically aware can sense Krueger's evil when they're near it." "If all of this is true," Cheryl said, "then why haven't Jerome or I ever heard anything about this guy? Even if he was only a regular human killer, he'd be a local legend. Kids would pass his story down from one generation to the next. But I've never heard the name Freddy Krueger in my life." "That's because after decades of losing their children to this monster, the adults of Springwood, many of whom had been children themselves during Freddy's earliest rampages, realized that the only way to defeat him was to cut off his access to his victims," Becca said. Various medications were tried to suppress the children's dreams, but while they worked for a time, drugs ultimately proved ineffective. Lynn picked up the story from there. So the adults reasoned that if they couldn't stop their kids from dreaming, maybe they could at least keep them from dreaming about Freddy. And if they didn't dream about him, if no one did, he wouldn't be able to get at the children, and maybe he'd even cease to exist altogether. Did it work? Jerome asked. Maybe the adults had a reason for their lies and their secrets, he thought. His anger didn't recede, but it didn't get any worse for the moment. Cheryl shot him a look as if to say, "You're not really buying this stuff, are you?" But she didn't say anything. Becca and Lynn exchanged glances. "More or less," Becca said. "The adults still know. Some of us, anyway. So Krueger's not completely forgotten. But we've worked very hard to make sure that no children or teens know about him. As a result, the killings have been fewer in numbers and more years pass between them. Krueger's like a disease. If you inoculate enough people against it, eventually the disease dies out because it can't find any new hosts. That's what we're hoping will happen with Krueger one day. That no one in Springwood will remember Freddy Krueger as anything other than a long-dead killer, and he'll become just another forgotten nightmare and vanish into the realm of dreams forever." Becca and Lynn fell silent after that. Cheryl looked at Jerome and then at the two women. "So you're telling us you really believe this ghost story?" She fixed her gaze on Lynn. "Both of you?" "Both of them what?" Don Starkey came back into the dining room and took his seat next to Lynn. Jerome felt a renewed surge of anger upon seeing his father. His own dad in on it with the rest of them? "Got them both down," he said. "Hopefully the little monkeys will sleep through the night and have pleasant dreams." "Or no dreams at all," Lynn amended. Don's expression became grim. "You told them about Krueger." It wasn't a question. "Yeah, they did, Dad," Jerome said, struggling to keep from raising his voice. "But what I want to know is how you could have kept this knowledge from me my whole life." Don frowned. "Didn't they tell you about the containment strategy?" "We did," Lynn said, and Becca nodded. Jerome understood then why his father had taken Brian and Mary upstairs, to prevent them from hearing about Freddy and becoming infected by the knowledge of his existence. "So, what part of it don't you understand?" Don asked. "We're just trying to protect you." He glanced at Cheryl. "All of you." "I'm not talking about that," Jerome said, feeling his anger start to rise again. "I'm talking about how Freddy Krueger killed my mother." Chapter 13. Lynn gasped as if Jerome had slapped her, and Don's face went pale. Becca's expression, however, showed only sadness and sympathy. "But your mom died in a car accident," Cheryl said. Then she added, "Didn't she?" "It might have looked like an accident," Jerome said, "but it wasn't. Not really." They all turned to look at Don Starkey, and in a soft voice he said, "Freddy was the one who caused her to crash. At least that's what we always figured." By we, Jerome knew his father meant himself and Becca. "The liars! The secret keepers!" "After Joanna died, I dreamed about Freddy," Becca said. "He taunted me, told me how he'd chosen her and why." She looked at Jerome but then quickly glanced away. "I think he wanted to kill me too, because he didn't want me interfering with his plans later on down the road. But I was psychically stronger than my sister, and more importantly, I was prepared for him. Despite his best efforts, Krueger was never able to kill me, and after a while, he gave up trying. I haven't dreamed about that bastard in years." There was something about the way Becca said this last statement that made Jerome think that while it might technically be accurate, it wasn't the whole truth. "Your dreams were probably just a coincidence," Cheryl said. "If people still talked about Freddy when you were younger, it only makes sense that you'd dream about him from time to time, especially if you were trying to come to terms with such a traumatic event like the death of your twin." Becca smiled. "You'll make a wonderful psychologist someday, Cheryl, but I assure you, my dreams were real." "Please understand, Jay," Don said. "We couldn't tell you the truth about what happened to your mother. Not if I wanted to keep the same thing from happening to you. Krueger took Joanna, but I'll be damned if I was going to let him take you as well." Part of Jerome was touched by the fierce love in his father's voice, but another part, the part where his anger sprang from, couldn't believe what he was hearing. So you, all of you adults, decided for us. You decided it was safer to keep your children in the dark instead of warning us about Krueger, instead of teaching us how to protect ourselves? Go, man, go, his inner voice urged. Let 'em have it, with both barrels. Don seemed suddenly unsure of himself. We didn't think of it like that, Jay. Jerome slammed his fist down onto the table and spoke in a low, dangerous voice. Don't call me Jay. Don glanced at Lynn, then Becca before saying, Sure, whatever you want, Jerome. Cheryl put a hand on Jerome's arm. It's okay, honey, calm down. They were just doing what they thought was best. He looked at Cheryl's hand and experienced an urge to yank his arm away from her touch, but he didn't. She was the only thing helping keeping his anger somewhat in check. What about what we think is best? What we think is best, what about that? He countered. We're adults now, or close enough. We should be able to make decisions about our own lives. Cheryl didn't respond, and Don and Lynn exchanged regret-filled glances. You've encountered Freddy in your dreams, Becca said, haven't you? Jerome didn't want to answer. Why should you tell them anything after they concealed the truth from you for so long? But Becca kept looking at him, her eyes filled with love and concern. Eyes set in a face that was the image of what his mother would look like today if she'd still been alive, and he found he could not ignore the question. Yes, the first time was last night after I accidentally broke my dream catcher. I've dreamed of him a few times since. Whenever I doze off, even if it's only for a couple minutes, he's always there. Cheryl opened her mouth as if she were going to say something, but then she closed it and gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. She might not believe in Freddy Krueger, but the message was clear. She believed in Jerome. Why didn't you say anything to us? Lynn asked. What was I supposed to say? Hi, Dad. Lynn, guess what? I dreamed about a Scarface killer who's some kind of undead dream demon last night. Pretty weird, huh? Don't get smart, son, Don corrected. But there was little force behind the words, and Jerome realized, with both a thrill of excitement and a pang of guilt, that his father was afraid of him, afraid to make him any angrier, afraid of what Jerome might do. Jerome tried to soften his tone as he added, Why would I say anything? I've never heard of Freddy Krueger before. That dream catcher was special, Becca said. It contained real power, enough to keep Freddy from entering your dreams. Jerome remembered something Krueger had said in one of his dreams. I've been trying to talk to you for years, but I was never able to get through to you. We had a bad case of telepathicus interruptus, you might say, until you had that little tantrum in your room and threw your shoe at the wall. Now you're receiving me loud and clear, Jerome. It seemed the dream catcher had been the real deal, and like an idiot, he'd gone and broken it. Over the last several hours since I saw you outside the video store, I searched through my library, Becca said, looking for some information, no matter how vague or obscure, that might allow me to repair your dream catcher, so Freddy will once again be denied access to your dreams. I found a few things, and I'll give the repairs my best shots, but I'm not at all confident that I'm up to the task. So what, Freddy's still going to be able to waltz into my skull and whenever he feels like it? Jerome said. Becca didn't reply. She didn't have to. There's something I don't understand, Cheryl said. Why did Freddy kill Jerome's birth mother, and why is he coming after Jerome all these years later? I'm not sure Krueger needs a reason, Becca said. He's not human anymore, if he ever really was to begin with. Causing pain and suffering amuses him, feeds him the same way food, air, and drink sustain us. But if I had to guess, I believe he went after Joanna because she was pregnant. Once Krueger entered Joanna's mind, he had access to Jerome as well, because he was still inside Joanna, still connected to her. I think Freddy did something to Jerome while he was still in Joanna's womb. Something that marked him somehow, changed him. Whatever Krueger tried to do 17 years ago, he didn't accomplish his goal. But now that Jerome's no longer protected by the Dreamcatcher, he's returned to finish the job. A sudden look of understanding came over Lynn's face. Do you think that might explain Jerome's problem with anger? That they're the result of whatever Freddy did or is still trying to do to him? Jerome imagined himself standing up, calmly walking over to stand beside Lynn, cupping the back of her head with the palm of his hand and then slamming her forehead against the tabletop. Once, twice, 3 times, until the dining table was covered with blood, brains, and bone, and his stepmother's face was a crushed ruin. Jerome gave his head a shake to clear it. He was still in his seat, and Lynn's face remained intact. Becca nodded. "I'd considered that, yes." "Listen to them talk about you as if you weren't even here," Jerome's inner voice said. He felt his anger begin to build again. "So Jerome's been what?" Don said. "Infected by Freddy somehow?" "They're talking about you like there's something wrong with you," the voice said. "Like you were born wrong. Like you're some kind of fucking freak." He saw himself grabbing his coffee mug, flinging the still-hot contents into his dad's face, then reaching across the table to slam the mug hard against his temple. He imagined hearing the twin sounds of breaking porcelain and shattering skull as his father's eyes rolled white, and he collapsed to the dining room floor. Jerome's hand twitched in the direction of his mug, but he didn't take hold of it and did his best to shove the image out of his mind. "Stay calm," he told himself. "Your dad's just worried about you, that's all." "Worried about what people are going to think of him, you mean? Worried that everyone will find out he fathered a sideshow attraction." Jerome clenched his teeth and tried to ignore that inner voice. But the rage continued to swell inside him, and he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had to get out of here now, before he did or said something he'd regret. He turned to Cheryl. "Give me Elle's keys!" His voice was harsh and raspy. It didn't sound like him at all. Cheryl blinked in surprise. "What?" "The keys!" he repeated, almost growling the words this time. "Now!" Cheryl frowned, but she reached into her jeans pocket, removed the keys, and handed them to Jerome. When they were in his palm, he curled his fingers around them and made a fist. The points of the keys dug painfully into his flesh, but he didn't care. In fact, he rather liked the sensation. He turned to go, but before he could, Becca reached over and took hold of his wrist. "Please, Jerome, don't leave. It's important that you remain here with us, so we can help you." An image flashed through his mind. He saw himself yanking free of Becca's grip, grabbing a fork off the dining table and ramming it into her left eye. He saw the eyeball pop like an overwrapped grape as the tines of the fork penetrated its surface, saw viscous goo mixed with blood pour down her cheek. He imagined shoving the fork deep into her brain and then twisting it around, as if he were trying to twirl a forkful of pasta. Becca gasped and pulled her hand from Jerome's wrist as if she'd been burned. She reached up to touch her left eye and seemed both surprised and relieved to find herself uninjured. Jerome was overwhelmed by a sudden surge of guilt that, instead of blunting his anger, only seemed to intensify it. But the guilt vanished almost as soon as it had come. He remembered the dream he'd had in Miss LeClaire's office, in which Freddy had told him the story of Pinocchio before jamming his finger blades into Jerome's gut. He remembered Freddy withdrawing the blades, remembering seeing a cricket impaled on one of them, remembered Freddy popping the insect into his mouth and eating it. What had Freddy said then? Something about Jerome's conscience getting in the way of his plan? A conscience Freddy had removed and devoured? "I have to leave." Jerome turned and ran out of the dining room. He heard Lynn call out after him, heard Becca say, "Let him go, he's leaving to protect us as much as anything else." Then Jerome was down the hall, in the foyer, opening the front door, running across the lawn towards Elle's car. He got behind the wheel, inserted the keys into the ignition, turned it, and pressed the gas pedal to the floor before the engine caught. The silver Eldorado leaped forward with a screeching of tires. The back end of the vehicle fishtailed, and Jerome nearly lost control, but he eased off the gas and managed to straighten the car out. He then flipped on the headlights and roared down the street. He had no idea where he was going, but that didn't matter, just as long as it was away. So focused was he on putting as much distance as possible between his family and his anger that he didn't notice a pair of headlights wink into existence in his rearview mirror and begin to follow him. "What did I tell you? What did I fucking tell you?" Pat Cottrell gripped the steering wheel of his 1976 Camaro so hard that it looked as if the knuckles might burst through the skin at any moment. In the passenger seat beside him, Brent Haney had both of his hands pressed against the dashboard to brace himself. A Godsmack CD was blasting out of the car's speakers, the bass so loud that Brent could feel the vibrations in his marrow. He would have worn a seat belt, but Pat always said the belts were for babies and pussies. so Brent never wore one when riding with Pat. But he wished he'd risk Pat's disdain and put one on this time. He had the feeling this chase was going to get real hairy, real fast. Yeah, you told me, all right. Brent knew from long experience that Pat never asked rhetorical questions. He might not always want your opinion about something. All right, he never wanted your opinion. But he always wanted an answer, preferably one that praised him somehow. After finding Eddie's body and calling in an anonymous tip to the cops, they'd parked Pat's Camaro down the street from Showtime Video and waited for Jerome to show himself. They were both surprised when Cheryl Geringer arrived and escorted James out to L's piece of shit Eldorado, and equally surprised when Cheryl drove. As the Eldorado had pulled away from the curb, Pat hit the Camaro's ignition and followed. We'll just hang back for now, Pat had said, and then though Brent didn't know the specifics of what his friend was thinking, his meaning was nonetheless clear. Pat might want revenge on Jerome, but he didn't intend to hurt Cheryl to get it. So they tailed the Eldorado to the Starkey residence, parked down the block, killed the engine, and watched Jerome and Cheryl go inside. Now we wait for Starkey to come back out, Pat had said. Brent wasn't sure what they were doing, and he knew it wasn't smart. Sure, he was freaked out by Eddie's death and wanted his killer to pay, but he wasn't excited about the idea of he and Pat personally exacting that vengeance, especially if they got caught. But more than that, he couldn't get the image of Eddie lying headless in the alley out of his mind. Jerome had killed Eddie with his bare hands. What might he do to the two of them if given a chance? But Brent wasn't about to voice his fears to Pat. It wouldn't do any good, and he certainly wasn't going to ask Pat to let him out of the car. Even if he did, which Brent doubted, he'd make sure Brent paid for his cowardice later, and paid big. Like it or not, Brent was along for the ride on this one, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Brent had wanted to ask what they'd do if Cheryl accompanied Jerome once more when he left the house, a distinct possibility as far as Brent was concerned. But Pat wasn't exactly tolerant of questions. His usual reply to them was, "If I want any shit out of you, I'll squeeze your head." So Brent had remained silent. But not long afterward, Pat's patience was rewarded when Jerome came running out of the front door alone and got into Elle's car, still alone, and drove off like he was desperate to qualify for a NASCAR race. Brent had wondered why Cheryl hadn't come with Jerome. Had they had a fight or something? But he didn't bother saying anything to Pat. He'd just say it didn't matter, just as long as Jerome was alone, and Brent figured that was true enough. So he stopped worrying about anything except being prepared to beat Jerome's head in, or worse, when they finally caught up with him. Pat hung back several car lengths, which Brent thought was a smart move. Pat's Camaro could no doubt leave the Eldorado in the dust, but they didn't want Jerome to get wise that they were following him. They trailed Jerome for several blocks. He was moving fast, and not once did he use his turn signal, or come to a full stop at an intersection. To Brent, it looked like Jerome was driving back and forth through various neighborhoods without any destination in mind, but after several minutes, Pat said, "He's heading out of town." Brent glanced out the window and saw that the houses were now fewer and farther between, the yards larger and trees more numerous. They weren't quite in the country yet, but they were getting there. "Do you think he's seen us and is trying to make a run for it?" Brent asked. Pat didn't answer right away, and Brent figured he was going to tell him to shut up, but instead he said, "By now he's probably noticed that a car's behind him, but I don't think he's figured out it's us. It's too dark and we're too far behind him for him to recognize my Camaro, so I think we're cool. Lucky for us, the fucking murderer's heading for the country. Plenty of room to play there, and no witnesses to worry about." Pat grinned and leaned forward like a wolf that's caught a strong whiff of its prey. He pressed down on the accelerator, and slowly the distance between the two cars began to narrow. "Wimp, cower, Phoebe." Jerome tried to ignore the names his inner voice was calling him. He wasn't aware of it, but his lips formed the words as they swirled in his mind. "I can't believe you're running away." "I'm not running," Jerome muttered. "I'm driving." "Hardy fucking har. So you're not just a loser. You're a funny loser." "I'm not going to hurt my family. Hurt Cheryl. Like what? Or maybe I should say, like who?" Jerome experienced a flash of memory, of slamming someone's head against a brick wall. "Never mind." He flipped on the radio and cranked the volume in an attempt to drown out the voice. The gentle tones of Stone Temple Pilots' Lady Picture Show filled the Eldorado. "Like Eddie Jackson." Despite the music, the internal voice came in loud and clear as ever. "No,
You're too much of a coward to face it, so you refuse to remember what we did. But in your guts, you know what happened. We took Eddie out once and for all, pulped his head like a rotten melon."
Jerome slammed his palm down on the steering wheel, making the car swerve a little, but not enough for him to lose control. "No!" he shouted, but the voice was right. He could deny it at the top of his lungs until the day he died. But deep down he knew it was true. He'd killed Eddie Jackson. That was why, after driving around aimlessly for a while, he'd finally decided to get to his destination.
"What are you talking about?"
The voice sounded suspicious and also a little afraid. We are going to Weston Hills. I'm going to check myself in before anyone else gets hurt." The voice was silent for several moments, and Jerome began to hope that it was going to leave him in peace, if only for a short while. But it turned out to be a vain hope, for the voice then said,
"You can't do that.
Watch me." Jerome had reached the edge of town, and it would only take a few more minutes until he reached Weston Hills. He didn't know if the doctors there could help him, but if all they could do was lock him away so he'd no longer be a threat to anyone, that would be good enough. And whatever kind of plan Freddy Krueger had for him, it would be awfully hard to execute if Jerome was locked up in a padded cell, or wherever crazy fucks like him were put these days.
"You've kept me trapped inside you all your life, Jerome, and every time I managed to get out of my cage, you put me right back in. But now that I finally have a chance to gain my freedom for good, I won't let you take it away from me."
Jerome started to reply, but before he could speak, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. They'd been back there for a while, and he hadn't thought too much about them. But now their reflection was getting larger. Whoever was behind him was coming up fast. Maybe whoever it was just wanted to pass. There were hardly ever any cops patrolling out in the country, and people, especially teenagers, often drove as fast as they wanted out here. Jerome eased off the accelerator, and the twin beams in his rearview mirror merged into a single glare of light. An instant later, there was a loud crunching sound, and Jerome's head whipped forward. "What the fuck?" He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and glanced over his shoulder to look out the back window. All he could see behind him was the bright wash of headlights, and then another impact came, and Jerome's head snapped front again. His seatbelt tightened and held him back, and the steering wheel suddenly felt strange in his hands, too loose, and he wondered if the second impact had done something to the steering, or one of the wheels. Nevertheless, he jammed his foot down on the gas. The crazy bastards were trying to run him off the road, and he wanted to get as far away from them as fast as he could. The old El Dorado hesitated for a moment, but El took good care of his car, and the engine let out a deep roar as the vehicle surged forward. But it was too little too late. The car behind him slammed into the El Dorado's bumper once more, and this time the rear end started to swerve to the right. Jerome was gripped by pure terror. Ever since he'd first learned as a child how his mother had died, he'd been terrified of dying in a car accident. His fear was so bad that he almost hadn't taken the driver's ed, and after he passed the class, almost hadn't got his license. Even then, he still didn't like to drive all that much, and wasn't that upset that he didn't own a car of his own. The swerve became worse, and the El Dorado headed into a spin.
"Shit! Shit's right, and we're in it deep, bro, but I can get us out. All you have to do is let me drive for a while. What do you say?"
The words passed through Jerome's mind with the speed of thought, and as the nose of the El Dorado began to swing around to face its attacker, Jerome knew the voice was right. It possessed a strength and savagery he did not, and it was his best chance for survival, just like in the alley. "All right, damn you, do it!" Jerome felt a welling up of glee, and then the darkness took him, and he knew nothing more. Okay, this has been chapters 12 and 13 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege. Hope you're enjoying the book so far. Please be sure to subscribe, click the bell so you always know when new chapters are dropping. Don't forget about the Jason X The Experiment giveaway. Check out my giveaway upload. It's got the details in it on how to win Jason X The Experiment. Also, drop me a comment. I'd love to hear from you guys. Click that like button. I'd really appreciate if you guys could take the time to do that. It'd really help me out. And be sure to spread the word so we can get even more fans onto this channel so they can experience these books with us. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening and
pleasant dreams!